Welcome to the Good Growing Podcast. I am Chris Enroth, horticulture educator with University of Illinois Extension, coming at you from Matcomb, Illinois. And we have got a great show for you today, gardening in small spaces. We'll dive more into this seemingly more and more popular topic, but you know I'm not doing this by myself. I am joined, as always, every single week by horticulture educator Ken Johnson in Jacksonville. Hey, Ken.
Hello, Chris. Yeah, there's definitely been an increase in, I think, both on the desire and the plants that do well in small spaces.
I agree. It seems like every time we do a vegetable gardening class and this topic of crop rotation comes up, that immediately draws the questions of, well, whoa, hang on, I don't have room to do all of this crop rotation that you're talking about. What do we do? And so, yeah, I think this is becoming more of a popular topic. And I think it really kind of stems a lot from, just societal things that are occurring, development patterns that happen. So I know with like the landscape industry, uh, we are getting bigger houses. The footprint of our homes are getting larger because, well, at least in years past, building materials have been cheaper or at least easier to acquire. Construction techniques have really made building more efficient. And so our homes have been getting bigger, but our lot sizes have stayed the same. And so a lot of our green industry folks, the ones breeding our landscape plants, our shrubs and trees, they've spent a lot of time focusing on smaller statured plants, dwarf miniature type plants to fit into these smaller landscapes. But we also have a lot more people that aren't necessarily buying houses right now. It's taking people longer to get into a home. They might be renting longer, or there might be in apartments later on in life, but they still want to have a garden. And so that's what we're going to dedicate our show today to, is gardening in smaller spaces.
Yes, yeah, I know when we were renting, we were fortunate. The landlords didn't really care if we tore up, made a garden. We had to replace it. But yeah, I know friends that had houses or classmates, in grad school where it was all pots because you
Yes.
you did not have the opportunity. You didn't have a lawn, you didn't have a community garden nearby that you could go to, stuff like that.
Yeah. Oh, that's the truth. Yeah, we were all whiskey barrels and pots all the time for us, attempting to grow tomatoes, starting out uh, with no money, no time. Yeah, yeah, it was interesting. If I'm trying to recall back to those early years of gardening in those whiskey barrels, it was, yeah, a lot of fun. Just starting out. What an amateur we were. Oh, but Ken, before we dive in, I think the show gets released on Arbor Day, so happy Arbor Day. Hope you get out there and plant some trees.
Happy Arbor Day. I got some trees. We got some places we're talking about planting trees. I need to cut some trees down first because they're not looking too great, and then replace them.
That's the spirit. That's the Arbor Day spirit. Cut those trees down so we can plant more. But that is the truth. Yeah, I do have a Norway maple. It it is dying. I mean, I thought it was verticillium wilt that might have killed it, but I think it's really just the droughts. I think it is just like recurring dry weather, gets leaf scorch in the summer, drops its leaves, flushes out new growth. I think it's just droughts. I have cut off dying limbs. I've done the little test to try to see if there's any dark streaking of its tissue. If I cut a slit in that bark or in that stem, it's all been clear. So I really think it's just environmentally related. So I got a big old Norway maple to cut down. I'm not sad about it. I don't like Norway maples. So we've already planted a black gum near that, which is also susceptible to verticillium wilt, which I didn't know until I planted it. So fingers crossed, diagnosis is correct. The verticillium wilt did not kill my Norway maple.
Find out soon enough.
Yes, we will. Oh, goodness. Well, back to the topic at hand, gardening in small spaces. So let's play off of this green industry idea of, you know, We have big hydrangeas. If you've ever grown just like a straight up maybe like limelight hydrangea, those get big. They get as big as like your house if you live in like a one-story house. Um, so then the industry came out with little lime, a smaller dwarf version of limelight, and it grows maybe waist to shoulder height on like a 5'5" human being. So let's stick with that idea of how we select our plants for our vegetable garden. Ken, do you have um, any plants? What do we do in terms of our plant selection for our vegetable gardens that might help them fit into smaller spaces?
Yeah, so like if you're looking through garden catalogs, a lot of times they will advertise them as like for pots. Is one occasion, and a lot of times the name is a giveaway to a lot of them to have dwarf or mini or some adjective that describing it
Hmm.
being small. And even you may even see like dedicated sections to these are good for patios or pots, things like that. And if you want to grow, say, tomato, you can just do an internet search for dwarf tomato plants, and you'll get all kinds of things spit out. So you can search for if you want a specific type of crop, looking for that. We've got plants that like lettuces and things like that. They don't get very big to begin with, so those are good options because if they're small to begin with. But some of our bigger plants are more popular garden plants are your tomatoes, the cucurbits, peppers, things like that that get bigger. That you could run into space constraints if you don't have a lot of room. More and more we are seeing again these dwarf types. So like sweet corn, there's one. It's the on deck hybrid. For this, I've never grown this one, but from the descriptions, it's 4 to 5 feet tall. They say plant 18 seeds in a 24-inch pot, which to me seems pretty tight spacing, but that's the company's recommendations. So if you want to grow sweet corn, you've got this that you can grow in a small area. You can grow it in the ground too if you've got a little bit of room, but they're not getting the 8+ feet tall like you would a normal sweet corn plant. For like watermelons, cucurbits can be rather large, vines 4, 5, 6+ feet long. Cal Sweet Bush is a watermelon. This is one we have grown. I believe it's an AAS winner from a few years ago. The the descriptions say 14 to 18 inches long. I think it's a little bit longer than that, maybe a little closer to 2, 2.5 feet, and then that can depend on the soil and what you're growing it in. But again, it's still much smaller than your traditional watermelon plants. Produce 2 or 3 fruit, 10 to 12 pounds, so that personal size watermelon. So the production may not be quite to the extent of the larger plants, but you're still getting a decent amount of fruit off of there. There's peas, which peas again aren't terribly big, but some of them they can get, depending on the cultivar, you can get 5, 6 foot tall peas. There's something like Tom Thumb garden pea, gets 8 to 9 inches tall. So again, a really good one for pots. Don't need a lot of space to grow very many of those. Jalapeno, there's a potapeno. I believe this is another AAS winner several years ago. One we've grown. It gets 12, 15, maybe 18 inches tall. You still get 35 to 50 jalapenos off of there. So you're still getting pretty good production off of that. And then for tomatoes, I personally have not grown any really dwarf types, but we're looking for cultivar examples here. There's the dwarf tomato project. So there's a whole, I guess, community science, citizen science, call it what you want, kind of project on breeding dwarf type tomatoes. So I think they're defining these dwarf tomatoes as 2 to 4.5 feet tall. I think those are like 130 or
Yeah.
so cultivars on their website.
136, something like that. Yeah.
Like for the northern, they haven't split them in a southern hemisphere. For like the northern hemisphere, the others 130 some cultivars. So there's a lot. And it's not just cherry tomatoes. There's ones that look like they're paste. There's slicing and stuff too. So you still get decent sized tomatoes off of those as well. So again, looking for those that have been bred to fit smaller areas.
Mhm. Well, and I guess those are things that we could put in the ground. They would remain a little small, but really today, are we kind of disguising this as like a container show? Is that what this is? Because what
Yeah,
is the
probably.
trick to small space gardening? Containers. That's what we do. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and all those could be, grown in pots. The watermelon, you'd probably let that cascade over or
Hmm.
build a trellis. You'd probably have to support the fruit. But yeah, all those could be grown in pots.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess for my yard, and if you've been listening or watching this show for any manner of time, you've heard me say I don't have much space to grow in. Not necessarily because space is lacking, but it's sunlight is lacking. And so, yeah, my primary method of growing, or at least crop rotation, is going to be usually trying to find as much room as I can in my landscape. So 1 year in the ground, and then I will flip to container gardening for probably a year. And incorporating those containers really do help me with my crop rotation. And and so yeah, I haven't done a very good job of selecting plants that are suitable for containers. I think I started this whole thing years ago with indeterminate tomatoes, and I quickly learned my lesson. That's not a great idea. Indeterminate tomatoes in a container. You talked about that on deck corn. I feel like a slight breeze might blow those over if you have that much corn in a like a 20-inch pot. Yeah, it'd be so, they're not tall, but they're still catching the wind. And I have had so many tomato plants, and other things just get toppled by just like a 5 mile per hour wind when that container soil dries out. But there's so much growth on top. Um, yeah, I would say, I'm not done a very good job at selecting for like plants for my containers, but I do know, as Ken said, those look for those adjectives in those seed catalogs. The one I really like are like the ones that say like patio, grow for your patio. It's really good marketing, I think, because I'm thinking, well, yeah, I would want some patio tomatoes on my patio, where I like to sit and relax and enjoy the yard. So there's also vegetables that are grown, very specifically for those, container situations, and those marketing folks have done a great job of naming these. I think the one I like is short stuff carrots. Little stubby carrots growing in your containers. But even if you have a deep enough container, a normal bolero carrot would do fine. You just have to have that a container with some depth to it. Um, but I would say when I'm gardening in my containers and I'm doing anything large like a tomato, I don't go anywhere under 5 gallons. I that is like 5 gallon container is the minimum size that I will use for a lot of things. So like if I'm looking at a tomato, I'm probably trying to go up to, let's say, 10 gallons, 7 to 10 gallons for my tomatoes. If I can get bigger than that, I'll put a single tomato plant in there. So I do have some 15-gallon size containers. Those are big, by the way. I got like 2 cubic foot of potting soil the other day. And I planted two 15-gallon containers. Um, so yeah, the potting soil is expensive now. And so the what I'll try to do is I'll try to even maximize that space a little bit more is I put like basil or something within those 15-gallon containers with my tomato plant, which also dries that container out even faster. So you got to be really on top of it with the water. Um, but so yeah, when we're thinking about container maybe size in terms of like the opening width, we want that kind of that top diameter no less than 20 inches when you're growing tomatoes. Um, and then when we're doing peppers, go a little bit smaller, like 16-inch containers, carrots a foot wide, onions, things like that, maybe down to 10 inches. Well, basically, Ken, best thing you can do for your plants, give them as much soil as volume as you can. That's like the most critical thing. I know a lot of people myself included, I've done this, I'm not proud of it. I'll put like empty milk jugs and stuff in the containers because I don't have enough potting mix to fill that volume. Um, and I guess you can do that, but it your plants will take better advantage of more soil volume that you can give them. So the more volume you give them, the better. That's just we're trying to emulate what they would be getting growing in the ground. Um, in the field, as we say, or in the actual garden soil. And when you're growing in a massive volume of soil, like in a garden, water doesn't necessarily pool up against the plant roots. It's able to drain away. There's a lot of oxygen and nutrients. There's a lot of microbiology happening within that soil, and so we're trying our best to replicate a lot of those physical characteristics of the soil. And so the reason why we use like a soil-free potting mix in a container is so that it facilitates good drainage away from the plant roots. If we would take just, our clay, heavy garden soil, put that in a pot, it would hold on to that soil. It would have the water would have nowhere to drain to. And so we try to create that drainage artificially using like a peat-based or a coconut coir-based potting mix. Now I know there's even a lot of these soil mix companies. They're beginning to incorporate more like wood fibers, more wood pulp into these. I think to try to reduce some of that peat use. And I think there's been more of a push in the gardening market to reduce the amount of peat moss that we are using in our potting mix. So I'm starting to see more wood pulp, more wood fibers, and more coconut coir being used in our potting soil mixes. And again, all of that is facilitate good drainage away from the roots, as much soil volume as you can give these plants. Um, Again, for my tomatoes, peppers, I don't go anywhere underneath 5 gallons. I try to go, 7 to 10 gallons or higher for those larger fruiting plants.
Yeah, and the bigger those plants get, the more soil, that more potting mix is going to be more, it's going to dry out. If you've got a standard sized tomato plant in a small pot, you're going to be watering that multiple times a day to
Mhm.
keep that from wilting and stuff. So and usually when you're talking about potting plants, house plant stuff, you don't want to have these giant pots for a small plant. Um, but I guess maybe the exception to that rule is with some of these bigger vegetables. You put that transplant in there, it's going to fill that in relatively
Yeah.
quickly. So you don't plant for again like trees, plant for what the future size is going to be. So keep that in mind. You may have
Mhm.
your little 6 inch tall tomato plant that's eventually going to end up being 3, 4, 5 feet tall, and fill up a good chunk of that pot.
The other thing also, so you might be listening and you say, but all I have is this old hanging basket container that had a petunia in it last year, and that's all I have to grow my pepper plant for this year. Um, and a lot of times, folks will call us up and we have to kind of, what strategies can you employ in a less than ideal situation? And so one of the things that I have recommended to folks is that, well, if you can't provide that soil volume, at least what we want to do is try to avoid that potting, that root ball from drying out too excessively, like going from like soaking wet to like super dry within a few hours. That's not good for the plant. So in order to try to moderate that soil moisture and even the temperature as well, I'll often say to folks, you know what, just go get a bag of like wood mulch at the store, and dress the put a couple inches worth of wood mulch on top of that pot. And if you have that pot sitting on the ground, heck, you might as well put wood mulch around that pot as well. And that's called healing in. It's not really the correct term, but that's, what we do in some cases with like trees and stuff. But you're sort of like piling mulch around it, essentially just insulating it so it doesn't dry out too quickly. And it just holds extra moisture. Could hold some pests too, but it's one strategy to help keep that root ball in that container from drying out too quickly.
Yes, it's all a give and take.
Yes.
And don't go on a very long vacation or have somebody that you can trust to water your pot.
Or get a automatic drip irrigation system. I didn't get that installed at your place yet, Ken. We're gonna get it done though.
Eventually, maybe someday.
one of these years. Oh,
So I'll say another complaint, maybe concern people have sometimes when, especially if you're like in an apartment or something like that, and you're putting this on a patio or a balcony or something like that, is protecting those surfaces because you don't want to lose your deposit or something like that. So you can put like you have with houseplants, you put those saucers underneath there, just making sure you're emptying that water. Don't let them sit in water because and well, we want there to be plenty of moisture. We don't want that potting mix to be saturated because then you don't have any of that oxygen in the potting media. Roots start rotting, plants die. So that's kind of one way. There are pots that will come with built-in saucers underneath of them as well. So that be one way you can try to keep that area uh, somewhat clean or protected from that, or even maybe elevating it off the ground so you don't have the water pooling underneath of it,
mhm.
which can sometimes lead to stands. There's pot stands and stuff you can get as well.
Yeah. I thought I was safe on the wood deck that we have in our backyard. So I just put, a couple pots. I think these were marigolds that we had planted in pots. Um, and they weren't supposed to be there permanently all summer long, but they were there for a few weeks. And when I went to move them, the marigolds had actually rooted into the wood boards underneath. I had not seen, I mean, extensively. Like they had, it's an older deck, so
It's time to
maybe it
replace it.
time to replace a couple boards, I'd say. But the roots surprised me, and when I went to move the plant, I, I had to like you know, kind of forcefully pull that plot off of that spot where it was. And the marigolds kind of stressed out for a few days after that. They lost a lot of roots. They were getting some good nutrition from those wooden boards. And so, um, what I do now though is a lot of times I'll take those like saucer containers. Yeah, I'll flip them upside down and I'll actually set the pot on top of the inverted saucer. Um, that way, at least the containers off the wood and not rooting into our old deck boards that we have in the backyard.
I think your bigger problem may be the deck boards.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I go out there and I jump up and down a few times a year. And I'm like, I think we're okay. We're still stable.
Yeah, get another 6 months out of it.
Yeah, yeah. This part's a little springy, but I think we'll be all right. I go out there before the kids go out there, and see how it goes. Well, Ken, we talked about a few of those different types of dwarf plants, but some of those containerized fruit plants, I would love to try these. I have not tried these yet. I believe our colleague Bruce Black has done classes about these, and one I remember him mentioning was raspberry shortcake. It's a raspberry plant that you can plant in a container, so I think that would be a lot of fun. I know there's like patio blueberries that you can also use, and I do recommend that. I have recommended that to folks, these patio blueberries because they have spring white flowers. My blueberries are actually blooming right now. Um, they have the blueberries, the edible fruit in the early summer, and then you have red fall color in the fall, and then you get red stems all winter long. And so it's a kind of would be a neat patio plant, provided you had a large enough container that was protected enough from some of those freezing temperatures that we would get. You want to protect those roots so that they don't just turn into a ball of ice. But yeah, I would love to try some of these, just smaller miniature fruits like raspberry shortcake. There's also baby cakes, blackberry. Um, and um, there's another one. It's like a series of different types of berries. Probably includes things like strawberries and blackberries, raspberries. It's called bushel and berry. Um, and so some company has developed multiple different types of fruiting crops or fruit crops, and they call it bushel and berry raspberry, bushel and berry blackberry. Um, and so they're they're described as being a perfect patio plant, the triple P. And they grow shorter. But I think with all of these perennials growing in pots, boy, there's a lot of P's in this sentence. There is an issue with that cold hardiness again. So you got to protect those roots in the wintertime here in Illinois.
Yeah, we've got a couple of the bushel berry. It used to be called brazzleberry. So yeah,
Mm.
strawberry shortcake is the raspberry. We've got that, and that's it's got good tasting raspberries. Usually the wildlife gets to them before we do, and we've had ours for 4 or 5 plus years now. So we've got them in the plastic whiskey barrel planters, and the growing media was up towards the top, and now it's about 4 inches down. So they need to be repotted because I same thing. We've got a couple blueberries, same thing, and I leave them outside, and I shouldn't because I think I get quite a bit of dieback on the blueberries. Um, but they're coming out of it. But again, they've that's potting mix has really subsided, so I need to refresh those. And we've got the baby cakes, and that thing is getting big. Like it
Mhm.
is going through the bottom of the pot into the ground. I can't move the pot anymore. And it's got some of those canes that are probably getting 3, 4 feet long on it. So it's a little bit bigger plant. At least in the one we've got, it is a little bit bigger. Um, I think it started producing. We got it last year. Started producing fruit last fall, really late because it really kind of struggled for a little bit, and then frost came before they really fully ripened. But it's loaded with flowers now. So if the wildlife doesn't get it before we do, I can report back later. But the go back to the raspberry shortcake. That's a nice mounded plant. I think it's probably 18 inches tall, maybe 2 feet tall. So it's not, again, when you think about your normal raspberry plant, which is significantly larger than that. So yeah, those
Mhm.
are those are a good option. And like blueberries, they've got all kinds of different types. They've got some that have pink berries, traditional bluish ones, and everything in between.
Yeah. Well, the other thing about that baby cakes blackberry, you say that's like growing out of the pot and going crazy. That's just blackberries for you. They're crazy. They're unruly. I grew a Illini hardy. This is not a dwarf plant. It grows like 12, 15 foot tall, but Illini hardy thornless blackberry, and that thing will take over your garden if you let it. Um, yeah, those blackberries bananas, which they're still pretty darn tasty when you get some fruit off of them, though. Especially, well, if your timing's right. I've definitely had some sour ones, but um, boy, you get that harvest just right. Oh, blackberries are excellent. I love blackberries.
So I'll let you know when they're ripe.
I will come
Need to
down.
move
I'll
down.
bring the drip irrigation material. We'll get it all. We'll do this all as one thing.
We'll pay you in blackberries.
Yes, yeah. I will leave with a stomach ache. All right, Ken. Well, we did talk about containers, which plays into a lot of small space gardening. But there are other strategies that we can employ when we're growing in a smaller space. And one of those is just growing up. If you have a vining crop that might creep and crawl, maybe going up would help. Or what I did, I don't know if this technically counts as trellising, which is what we're talking about now, but when I grew my cucumbers last year, I cascaded them down the retaining wall. So my one of my full sun locations, I ran out of horizontal growing space, but I still had these lemon cucumbers that had to grow somewhere. So I planted them along the retaining wall and I had them cascade downward and over. So when I was watering the plant, I was actually uphill. I was on top of the wall. But when I was harvesting, I would walk around and I would harvest with the fruits kind of at eye level. That would seem to work out very nicely. The lemon cucumbers, it's a smaller-ish cucumber, about softball, baseball size. And so it didn't really need any additional support. But yeah, trellising, growing up or down, I would say,
Yeah.
as options.
Yeah. I think usually we define it as up, but yeah, I hadn't thought about trailing.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I think usually one reason it's a lot of times it's the cucurbits because they do take a lot of space. Cucumbers, pretty much any cucumber would be a good option because if we're harvesting the fruit on time, they're not getting too big and too heavy to pull those to pull the vines down. Maybe some of the smaller like mini pumpkins and stuff you could get away with. But if you're growing some of your medium or larger size pie pumpkins or jack-o'-lantern pumpkins, you're going to have to support those fruit in some way. Otherwise, they're going to pull your vines down. So making a
Mhm.
hammock, tying that, somehow supporting that fruit as it grows larger to do that. So best bet's probably smaller fruit stuff, but you can do it for larger stuff if you're willing to take a little extra time. And you've got a sturdy enough trellis to support fruit that may be 10, 15, 20 pounds on top of all the plant material um, as well. And even things like zucchini, which don't really get all that big, you can still kind of grow those up and save some of that space on the ground. And depending on how you trellis stuff, you could even grow, maybe you could try growing some cool season stuff, lettuce, stuff that may you can get away with a little less sunlight. Maybe that shade give a little bit, make it a little bit cooler microclimate there. Maybe extend out some of that stuff a little bit longer into the summer than you would be able to otherwise.
Mhm. Ken, when I visited your garden last year, I got some really great inspiration of how you just ripped two by fours in half and used that as your trellis. So these are like 8 foot long two by fours. You ripped them in half. Um, so I did the same thing at my place, and I had to get on a ladder to like sledgehammer them into the ground. But they were super sturdy once they were in the ground, and I used them primarily for my tomato supports. Um, and so got plenty of height, fairly sturdy. When I use some of those like wooden stakes for like that you can get at like a hardware store or somewhere, a lot of times they'll rot by the end of the summer. Like the base will be rotten and they'll be falling over. Um, but just a straight up pine 2x4 lasted me a whole summer. I got them still this year, so we're going to put them back in the ground for this growing season. So, yeah, a lot of trellising I've found people have just sort of found stuff around the house to create these
Mhm.
trellises. A lot of times they don't work, but sometimes you build a pretty sturdy structure and they work very well. So thank you, Ken, for such a great idea to just take an old 2x4 and rip it in half. And that became two posts for me.
But sometimes we have had them where they have started to warp and they're almost C-shaped
Hmm.
by the end of the year, depending on how that grain is. But yeah, it's worked out. And we got pressure treated boards, so we've had them in the ground for 3 or 4 years now.
Hmm.
Haven't had any issues, and that's the copper stuff. So I'm not really concerned about that, leaching into the soil where it's going to cause any toxicity or anything like that. I was thinking, one thing if like green beans, if you're the vining beans, teepees, things like that, you could still just a regular trellis to just get stuff off the ground, save that space for other things.
Yeah. Yeah. I particularly like at our food donation garden here in Macomb, our it's just a cattle panel that's just bent in kind of a, I guess, upside down U lowercase n shape, basically a tunnel. We have a green bean tunnel very often, or on opposite years, we'll have a cucumber tunnel. And we trellis up our pole beans or our cucumbers. And so it's a great place to be and to spend time because it's trellised. You find I find myself in the shade there more often, picking and things. And then yeah, we have space then in the beds that allow us to plant things like lettuces, on underneath of those.
Yeah, and we're talking about the space saving here, but ease of harvest as well, because yeah, like you mentioned with your cucumbers, all that stuff is now eye level or at least up off the ground, so you're not as bending as much, and it's not as taxing on the body maybe
Hmm.
when it's up higher eye level and stuff. So just another advantage of trellising.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned treated lumber. So another space-saving technique that I'm reading a lot about is using raised beds. And I think a lot of what some of these articles that mention this as a space saver are assuming, well, maybe you have lousy soil in your yard that does not allow you to grow a garden successfully, or maybe you have contaminated soil where you can't grow a vegetable garden. Um, I know probably for me, a raised bed wouldn't be much of a space saver, but there are ways we can utilize raised beds um, to help us grow perhaps maybe a bit more densely or maybe a bit more calculated. I know one of those is a square foot gardening method where essentially you have a raised bed and you are calculating out every single square foot and what that square foot can hold in terms of a crop. So with tomatoes, it would be you would need 4 square feet of that bed for one tomato plant. But for carrots, you could maybe take 12 carrots in 1 square foot. And so it's calculating that all out to maximize space utilization with that square foot gardening method. And so, yeah, that's one way I've seen raised beds used to save space. But also, if again you just have lousy soil, just don't grow in it. Hey, and now you've created yourself a whole new garden area with a raised bed on top of it.
Yeah, I think with well, I speak for myself here. Like when I'm doing in ground, it's small, nice straight lines.
Hmm.
Um, and I kind of spread out more than I would maybe need to, but because I've got the space. But in raised beds, you've got that. I'm usually doing more of that grid, regardless if I'm doing a square foot. I'm doing more of a grid just because I've got less room and I'm trying to squeeze as much as I can in there. So I think it kind of forces you to use that space more efficiently than sometimes you would in ground where you've got a little more room and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, you're planting in blocks, and that's because with the raised bed, you can get at it from all different angles. As long as you can reach across that bed, you'll be okay. Yeah, in ground, you got these long rows. Well, you don't want to walk, you know, too far around or anything. So, you have your one row and you have your walking lane and you got your other row and your walking lane. And so, yeah, I can see how you would spread out more in an in-ground garden situation.
Yeah. Sometimes in the ground, I forget to make my walking lanes too, which makes management and harvest interesting.
Well, yeah, then you need to get the machete and hack your way through the plants to get to the actual crop that you want. So, another strategy, and this was one that I don't think I read about, but it just is one that I have employed in the past, is just being more seasonal in the crops that you select. So, okay, I don't have room to grow lettuce and tomato, spinach, carrots, some of these other things. And so I in more intentional in that, okay, earlier spring, I'm going to focus on some of these really short, cool season crops, radishes, arugula. Spinach can be short-ish, but some of the lettuces, and then transitions over into a warm season crops, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, all of those things, and then late in the season I'll transition back to more of maybe more longer term cool season crops, some of our kales, some of those other brassicas out there. And so just I'm just more intentional about my seasonality. This gives me a more diverse array of vegetables that I can grow at least in a given year, not necessarily in a given space though. Like I can't grow it all at the same time, but I can grow it all there within the year.
Yeah, getting into that intercropping, replacing
Hmm.
stuff, and even when like you got your cool season spring stuff, you could interplant your tomatoes with that as you're harvesting those, pulling those out. Then your tomatoes are already there, filling in the space, and vice versa in the summer or in the late summer, fall. Start putting in your cool season stuff as your tomatoes are there, and then either they get killed or you're tired of dealing with tomatoes and you remove them. Then your
Hmm.
cool season stuff is there to take over.
Yeah. Yeah. So just I and I think a lot of folks, they especially just starting out in gardening, you think, oh, the gardening season is from May, middle of May till, maybe when the first frost is. But no, we can grow stuff so long as we got enough sunlight in the day. So, If we get over 10 hours of sunlight in the day, plants are actively growing, as long as they can handle the colder temperatures that they would be experiencing at those times. Or if we protect them with using like row covers or low tunnels, something like that, a cold frame.
All right. Last one we got here. So I guess this is kind of getting into, I guess, edible landscaping, but interplanting or yeah, going that edible landscaping where you're integrating your food crops in with your ornamentals or ornamentals in with your food crops, vice versa. We're not necessarily having a dedicated bed, which I think when most people think of vegetable gardening, you've got your vegetable garden, you got your flowers, and the two shall never meet. But it's kind of incorporating those into each other. Again, you can use your space more efficiently. There are vegetable crops that do have some ornamental appeal to them. So some of the okras can be very ornamental looking. Some of the peppers, I think we talked about it. And if you're doing the grow along, the Christmas pepper we're growing this year has got upright peppers. Usually those are hot, but this is a sweet pepper, but they do have an ornamental look to them. Things like artichokes, if you want to grow that, they've got the nice foliage. You're harvesting the flower buds, but if you let those bloom, which you're not really growing the artichokes for food then, but they've got very pretty flowers. So if you miss one, you've got that. Cardoon is a basically relative of artichokes. It gets much bigger. You're eating the leaves of that. It kind of looks like something out of Jurassic Park when it's full grown. Or things like runner beans that have very red, have red flowers, very ornamental flowers. The pods can be ornamental, but you can eat them as green beans. Let them dry down. Use them as shelled beans. Stuff like this. There's a variety of different ways we can incorporate some of these things into our landscapes. Even there's flowers. A lot of flowers are edible too. So nasturtium, marigolds, all of that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Ken, you don't do this for like edible vegetables. At least I don't think you did. But you've planted even the hell strip out in front of your house, an area between the street and the sidewalk, with ornamental plants. Some native plants. But I remember one year I had an extra pepper plant. I'm like, where am I going to put this? Well, there was a full sun spot over by the fire hydrant. And so I was by the road. And so I planted that pepper plant over by the fire hydrant, 6 feet away, because I think that's what the city had required at the time. But I had great peppers growing there. I was always kind of like, well, what if someone takes my peppers? But then I thought, I guess that's all right with me. I know if somebody wants to take some peppers, then they can have them. I guess I can still go to the farmer's market or the store and get more peppers, so I'm not that worried about it. But yeah, I tried to throw as many vegetables as I could find full sun areas, and one of them just so happened to be right next to the road right there. I'm not really thinking about any contaminants or anything like that, pollution, so dirty water, dogs peeing on it. That didn't come to mind until after the fact.
Ignorance is bliss.
That's right. So just pretend like I didn't say that, folks, and you'll feel great. No, you have to take all those risks into consideration.
Yeah, I think but so yeah, just if you're gonna do this, think about those plants, and I guess you'd probably be able to speak to this better than I would, but those landscape designs, the different foliage and then the contrasts and this, that, and the other. There's ways you can incorporate this stuff, and some trial and error. Sometimes it may look good, sometimes it may not.
Yeah,
you always got next year to try again.
Mm-hmm. That's right. The eternal optimist is the gardener. There's always next year. So, well, that was a lot of great information about how to utilize some of our smaller yard space to do more gardening. Well, the Good Growing Podcast is a production of University of Illinois Extension, edited this week by Ken Johnson, and a special thank you to Ken. Thanks for hanging out, giving some tips and tricks about gardening in small spaces this week.
Yes, thank you, and go check on that deck. Make sure doesn't need replacing.
Go jump on it here just a little bit. Make sure me and the dogs will go out there, and we'll just make sure our weight doesn't cause the whole thing to buckle.
And let's do this again next week.
Oh, we shall do this again next week. The horticultural hijinks continues on the Good Growing Podcast. So tune in next week to hear the gardening topic that we shall devise between now and then. Well, listeners, thank you for doing what you do best, and that is listening. Or if you're watching us on YouTube, watching. And as always, keep on growing. This is very interesting ASMR podcast. It's just called Garden Research.
It's like watching paint dry.
Yeah, just two guys reading. Ignore everything I just said there in the meantime. Cut that all out.